We're doing the 3.1 to 3.3 extra review. I am going to try to make this as short as possible. There's not going to be a lot of color coding, a ton of explanations, but you need to know how to do an absolute min and max on your test. So that means you have to first of all find your derivative. So my derivative of cosine is negative sine of x. Okay, and the derivative of x is 1, so I don't need that. I need to take that negative sine of x and set it equal to 0. Oops, I forgot my x. And sine of x would equal 0. And that means that I would be looking at all of my places where sine is 0. Sine would be 0 at 0 radians and at pi radians. Okay, then I also need to take that negative sine of x and set it equal to undefined because we're after our critical points. And this gives me none. So all I know is I have these. Now, the one thing you guys have got to get used to are, do these make sense? And in this case, it doesn't, both of them don't make sense. The pi is too big for my intervals, so 0 is my only place. Now, for absolutes, things are a little bit different than what they are for regular intervals, finding mins and maxes. So I need to start with my x values, and remember with your x values, 0, it could be a possible x value, negative pi over 2 could be an x value, and 3 pi over 4 could be an x value. Remember, in this case, you're plugging it into the original function, which is cosine of x, and you're finding your y values. So when I put 0 cosine at 0, I hopefully know that my answer is 1. When I do cosine at negative pi over 2 or 3 pi over 2, my answer is 0. And when I do my cosine at 3 pi over 4, again, I would be thinking of drawing out my triangle here at 3 pi over 4. I'm going to come up with 1 over root 2, but it's in quadrant 2. It's cosine, so it would be negative 1 over root 2. So my absolute minimum, my smallest point, would be at negative pi over 2 comma 0. I'm sorry, that is not my minimum. Erase. My smallest point would be at negative absolute, for my absolute minimum, the smallest point, pitching, would be 3 pi over 4, comma, negative 1 over root 2. And then my absolute maximum, my largest point, would be at the point 0, comma 1. Okay, so that's absolute mins and maxes. So doing the same thing again for the next problem. The first thing I need to do is find my derivative. So f of x equals negative 4x to the third plus 2x. I have to set that equal to 0. And as I set that equal to 0, I see there's a GCF of positive 2x that I can pull out. That would give me a negative 2x squared plus 1 would equal 0. Do some math. 2x equals 0, so you know that x is going to equal 0. And then negative 2x squared plus 1 would equal 0. So x squared would equal positive 1/2. X would equal plus and minus the square root of 1/2, which is positive 1 over root 2. Okay, so looking to make sure that everything makes sense, they do. So I am going to, before I go too far, I've already done this in my head, but I need to make sure that you guys know that you need to check it every time, that negative 4x squared plus 2x equals undefined. and you get none. Okay, so now back to my little chart here. I'm going to make my x and my y's. I am going to check x values of 0, negative 1 over root 2, positive 1 over root 2, and I'm looking at my interval also of negative 1 and positive 1. So I am plugging it into the original, negative x to the fourth plus x to the second minus 1. My y values in this case, when I plug in 0, I get negative 1. When I plug in negative root 2, I get negative 3/4. When I plug in positive 1 over root 2, I get negative 3/4. When I plug in negative 1, I get negative 1. And when I plug in positive 1, I also get negative 1. Now, minimum, the lowest that this goes for my absolute minimum, the lowest points are negative 1, negative 1, negative 1. I have to list all of those since they tie. If they didn't tie, I would just take whichever one really was the lowest. So all of those would be considered my absolute mins. My absolute maxes, in this case, that's tied. Those two there. So I have to have both 1 over root 2 and negative 3/4. I'm sorry, negative 3/4. Ooh, that looks really bad. And negative 1 over root 2 and negative 3/4. Sorry about the scribbles on that one. Okay, so last one of these. This one has a little trick, and I'm going to circle it right here, that 1 can't be used. No 1. Okay, so first thing I've got to do, I've got to find my derivative. So I end up with negative 3x squared plus 6x. Set that equal to 0. And when I do that, I see that there is a GCF of 3x, and I'd be left with negative x plus 2 equals 0. And x would equal 0 when I set it equal to 0, and positive x would equal 2 when I set it equal to 0. Now, I also need to ask, do they make sense? And sometimes I write it down, here I didn't, and 0 doesn't make sense. It's not in my interval, so I can't use that. I also need to think, and again, I've done this in my head, but I need you guys to see that I'm looking at it. Does the undefined work? Nope, none. So what's going to happen? I'm going to have my x values, and my x values that I can test. I can't test 1, I can test 3, and I can test 2, and that's it. I'm plugging it into my original equation of negative x cubed plus 3x squared minus 1, and then my y values turn out to be negative 1 and positive 3. So my mins, my absolute mins would turn out to be, my lowest point would be 3, negative 1, and my absolute max would turn out to be 2, 3.